I have it on good authority that several of our speakers are planning to go overtime, so we have to start right now. Just by a couple minutes. All right. We have a lot of work to do. We're moving forward on the arc. We are trying to map the moment that we're in. And this panel, we're calling Fascism as Capitalist Counter-Revolution, because that's a through line in a lot of what is happening. It's not the only explanation, but it is one of the ways that we can understand these surging fascist forces. And we have 4 speakers with us today who are going to speak to different aspects of how fascism manifests through backlash to revolutionary movements. Once again, as a reminder, you can find full bios for speakers in the programs. They're all incredibly accomplished, and I'm not going to be reading out their bios now. We're going to hear first from Brenna Bhandar, who's going to share insights on the backlash against settler colonialism specifically. Brenna is an associate professor of law at UBC. Her work focuses on property studies and legal theory, specifically in relation to settler colonial regimes. Thanks, Brenna.
Okay, thank you very much, Naomi, and I want to thank all the organizers of this event, and also thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm very nervous when I'm asked to speak for 15 minutes, and then Naomi told me we have 10, so I'm even more nervous. Okay, 15's okay. So I also just want to note how great it is that you have childcare, because, and I was going to make a gender point, but I think if there hadn't been childcare, our preeminent theorist of fascism would probably be at home with our kid. Anyway, so, okay, I'm going to try and speak to this, When Truth Becomes a Smear, the Backlash Against Settler Colonialism, and thank you, Naomi, for the title. So I will first, obviously, the first point to begin with is the new anti-Semitism discourse. And this, actually, a discourse I have had difficulty in paying much attention to because it is so unrigorous when it comes to actual scholarship on settler colonialism. But the 2 themes I want to try and speak to in this time that I have are the themes of denialism and impunity. So if you come away thinking about 2 themes from this short intervention, think about denialism and how denialism is one of the ways in which Zionists and supporters of Zionism, people who want to keep promoting white supremacist, settler colonial, fascistic ideologies, it allows them to act with impunity. Now, when it comes to the new anti-Semitism discourse, we can look at the work of Adam Kirsch or Noah Feldman. The main objective of this new anti-Semitism discourse is to read settler colonial studies in a way that facilitates the same old conclusion that criticism of Israel is actually rooted in anti-Semitism. Part of the problems with this discourse is their starting points. So Noah Feldman often refers to 1948 as a starting point, and Adam Kirsch begins his critique of the new anti-Semitism really with October 7th, 2023. And part of the argument here is that because Israel is a Jewish state and because it must be a Jewish state as a matter of justice and historical reparation, to criticize Israel is always to risk being anti-Semitic. Now, what are the effects of this form of backlash against settler colonial discourse? The new discourse of anti-Semitism provides another alibi for those engaging in what Sari Makdisi analyzes as the denial of the reality of racial apartheid and Palestinian dispossession. And so just to read a little bit about Sari Makdisi's work, he provides a layered and wide-ranging account in his book, Tolerance is a Wasteland, which I recommend to you if you haven't read it, on the nature of contemporary denial or denialism that pervades the rhetoric of both Zionists and their supporters, one that has transcended mere bad faith or hypocrisy and rather operates as an act of denial so complete, so comprehensive, that it cannot recognize itself as an act of denial in the first place. So he argues that the condition for the denial of Palestinians' rights to exist in their homeland is the positive affirmation of Israel's commitment to liberal values, tolerance, environmental sustainability, diversity in the form of gay and lesbians' rights, and so on. And the affirmation of liberal values enables Zionists and their supporters to deny that they are denying the continued displacement and dispossession of Palestinians. And of course, this is precisely the argument that we have heard over and over again as a reason to not support BDS, reiterated ad nauseum by our own university administrators. And the idea that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state that must be supported and protected is something that even in the moment of genocide, we hear being repeated over and over again. Makdisi concludes his book, Tolerance is a Wasteland, by observing that much of the analysis he offers in the book is being surpassed by an outright embrace of explicit racism and a shift to the far right. The book was written prior to October 2023, prior to the recent election of the re-election of Trump, etc. But we can see this certainly evident in the Republican Party in the US, but also recent regimes of Modi, Bolsonaro, Duterte, Orban, and others. In his view, in Makdisi's view, the shift to the far right, certainly a fair description of the current configuration in the Knesset, is making a myth of Israel's status as a protector of liberal values much harder to sustain. It is much more difficult to sustain the denial of the denial when prominent Israeli ministers just even describe themselves as fascist. Yet, even in the face of explicitly supremacist laws that enshrine Jewish domination over Palestinians as a legal fact and right, we can also note that the current conjuncture is giving way to an affirmation of genocidal violence and the right of some states to act with complete impunity. Now, I want to shift briefly to this idea of impunity as the psycho-juridical basis of our current conjuncture. And I want to think about how impunity is in fact built into the law of settler colonies. Okay, I have an image of the proposed real estate developments on the scorched earth of Gaza as an example of the kind of impunity we are seeing being performed day in and day out. But to get back to impunity and how it's built into our legal system. So in Canada, as we've been hearing this morning, we have the Royal Proclamation of 1763 that essentially is the starting point for the assertion of European sovereignty over Indigenous land here. In British Columbia, as we know, we have terra nullius, a history of terra nullius in all but name. And I can also talk, if there's time later, about legal doctrines such as the doctrine of preemption, which essentially enabled the outright theft of Indigenous land. In Palestine, we have the beginnings of the same kind of illegality built into the legal foundation of Israel, beginning with the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which promised the creation of a Jewish national homeland, which then, by the end of the British Mandate, transforms into a promise for the establishment of a Jewish territorial state, and the partition resolution of 181, of course, in the aftermath of the Holocaust. Now, this is often in the discourse of the new anti-Semitism when they are critiquing the critics of Israel. They say Israel is not like other settler colonies because it has a legal foundation. Resolution 181 was passed by the UN, etc. However, what we see in that passing of that resolution is the complete denial of another law, which was at the end of the mandate, that the self-determination of Palestinians, legally speaking, should have been recognized. And we also have, of course, the founding violence and illegality that accompanies the partition of Palestine. So the point about impunity that I'm trying to make is that it is twofold, right? We have the violence that is always, to quote Derrida, walled up as a silence in the founding of the nation state, but we also have in this moment the performance of impunity that is part of the psychosocial moment that we are in. We have what is being performed in this moment, the blatant and exaggerated display of impunity, which gives license to people's most primitive or base traits. We see it in states that are embracing illegality and violence in the name of morality, right? In the name of our security, in the name of our self-defense. Indeed, and Palestine is certainly a paradigm. I also just want to note that Iraq is also a paradigm. So we see in as the international legal scholar Nathaniel Berman pointed out, that appeals to a transcendent set of moral and or political imperatives were used to justify the violation of international law in relation to the war on Iraq. So I want to conclude, I'm probably getting maybe over time, okay, thanks. Okay, so, in thinking about impunity and thinking about its relationship going back to denialism, this has all come home very recently in the last 2 weeks in the form of a lawsuit that the BC Civil Liberties Association has described as perverse. But just bringing it to a very local level, nearly 2 weeks ago, 4 professors, they're named there, and 1 graduate of a UBC PhD program launched a petition at the BC Supreme Court for judicial review of 3 things that they believe are violating their academic freedom: land acknowledgements, EDI, and any statements on Israel-Palestine. Now, this is interesting, of course, because we often criticize land acknowledgements for having the potential, as they are often performed by our administrators, by our politicians, as a kind of tick box exercise. We also criticize EDI as operating as a fig leaf to cover up structural racism and other structural forms of subordination. And we have also seen the petitioner's claim relies on Section 66 of the Universities Act, which states that universities have to be non-sectarian and non-political. Now, obviously, this is a totally ridiculous notion of the meaning of non-political for a university, right? But we've seen our own university administrators use Section 66 to force departments to take off Palestine solidarity statements from their websites and to make it very difficult to express solidarity with Palestine on our campuses. So I know this is being recorded, but we can think about how they've opened the door to this kind of litigation themselves. But I want to conclude by just reading 1 paragraph from an article that I did write on the importance of land acknowledgements as a political device, to also acknowledge how this lawsuit presents us with an opportunity to show why these 3 things are tied together and how they are related to each other. To express solidarity with Palestine and to speak about the complicity of the state of Canada and its public institutions in the colonization of Palestinian lands, the maintenance of an apartheid regime, and genocidal violence in Gaza in the moment of the land acknowledgement, is to challenge the legitimacy of settler states, both Canada and Israel, as racial colonial projects. This disrupts the liberal script of acknowledgement and reconciliation in different ways. First, it challenges the idea that colonial land theft and genocide are in the past in Canada. Second, it draws out the affinities between Indigenous struggles for land back here in Canada and the active and current resistance of Palestinians to land theft, apartheid, and genocide. When spoken by racialized academics, because we know these forms of harassment are not evenly distributed, when spoken by racialized academics who bring to bear a third world or internationalist political framing to Palestine, it challenges the conceptual separation of racialized settlers and Indigenous peoples who, in the liberal script, only exist in a dyadic relation to whiteness. It collapses the distinction between settler and other colonialisms and brings them into the same framework. The expression of solidarity with Palestinians by racialized settlers and Indigenous peoples in particular temporalizes and spatializes colonial violence as a present condition both of Canadian settler violence here and its imperialism abroad. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Brenna. We're going to have time for questions and conversation at the end. But one thing I would just say about that lawsuit, and it relates to what I said in my opening, is I think our opponents understand that when they look at this generation of young people in the encampments making these connections, they understand they're starting to show their hand, that what they see the root of the problem is a generation of young people starting to understand colonialism. And so now they're realizing that if they're going to protect the exceptional ethno-state, they actually need to wage war on anti-colonial education. So another reminder of how urgent these solidarities are. So next we're going to hear from Avery Everhart, who's going to be speaking about the role of the anti-trans backlash and where it fits into this fascist constellation. Avery is an assistant professor at UBC Geography and co-founder and fellow of the Center for Applied Transgender Studies. By the way, you'll be hearing there's a lot of people from UBC Geography. They weren't on our list of co-sponsors. They are. Avery's recent work, yes. Avery's recent work focuses on how data and misinformation shape the conditions in which trans lives are lived. Thank you, Avery.
I'm so tall. I refuse to crouch, so we will try. Thank you, Naomi, for inviting me, even though it's caused a series of anxiety attacks, but I'm still grateful to be included. And I was tempted to just make jokes about how trans people aren't the reason that you can't afford eggs. But for the sake of time, I'm going to jump right in, and I invite feedback and questions, and there's a lot of cross-pollination and connections to make. So I look forward to our conversation after each of our remarks. Those familiar with gay history might be experiencing an acute and chronic sense of déjà vu in recent years. And whether you are or aren't familiar with gay history, you might remember Anita Bryant, former Florida Orange Juice spokesperson, chanteuse, and perhaps most famously the recipient of a well-timed pie to the face in Des Moines, Iowa, by the hand of one Tom Higgins in October of 1977. Bryant took up the mantle of moral panic in the 70s to advocate against gay rights. Her argument was that gay rights amounted to special privileges rather than rights, and that they impinged upon her and other moral, upstanding Christian Americans' right to practice their religion. Her anti-gay advocacy also pulled on a moral discourse of protecting or saving children and families, claiming that gay people were recruiting them, grooming them essentially to become gay and perverting their natural, God-fearing, heterosexual inclinations. She ultimately was successful in her immediate goal of advocating to repeal an ordinance in Dade County, Florida, home to Miami, that ascribed protected status to gay and lesbian people. Shortly thereafter, she lost momentum and was fired from her job as Florida Orange Juice spokesperson in 1980, but the legacy of her work lives on in the form of the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida and myriad related legislative attempts to stigmatize or even criminalize queerness and transness via this invocation of children. What might, and that's a stretch, but what might be different this time around from prior anti-queer activism is that self-avowed feminists have aligned with far-right activists in their advocacy against transness. One might imagine that the goals of feminism and extreme conservatism are at odds, and Sophie Lewis, and perhaps even further back Andrea Dworkin, among others, remind us that there's a lot of history between these supposedly strange bedfellows. This apparent contradiction is thrown into relief when we recognize that nothing motivates people more than hate or disgust. In her book, Ugly Feelings, Sayan Nyai contends that the feeling of disgust is urgent, and it blocks sympathetic identification with the object of disgust, rendering whatever brings on that feeling as intolerable. In the age of misinformation and political polarization, the left and right, such as they cohere at their respective ends of a political spectrum, both rely upon disgust, outrage, and other affective appeals as the political means to opposing or even mutually exclusive ends. We might even argue that the relative lack of resistance to fascism from liberals in Canada and the US and elsewhere stems from this outdated attachment to principles of tolerance, acceptance, or neutrality. And here we could also maybe even talk about the Canadian Multicultural Act, how it operates in this valence, et cetera. But what we find here in the forms of Matt Walsh, famous for his anti-trans documentary, What is a Woman, and Posey Parker on the bottom right, who coined and capitalized upon the term adult human female as a common sense rallying cry for the reality of sex, there's a lot of scare quotes, brace yourself, is a convergence of political goals with at least ostensibly dichotomous ideologies. While some claiming to be feminists espouse tolerance for trans people, they, along with the far right, mobilize disgust to render trans people as intolerable. The only potential difference is how some self-identified feminists are careful to characterize transgenderism as disgusting, violent, and intolerable. In contrast, the far right, they really don't give a shit about being seen as tolerant or not. And in fact, tolerance might be antithetical to their goals. However, they share a goal of stoking the flames of anti-trans sentiment, and more recently, it seems they've shifted focus to children. The far right enlist children as soldiers of the culture wars and insist that these nameless, faceless young people have fallen victim to the grooming epidemic of gender ideology. Making good on his promise to go after trans people day one of his second term as president, Trump signed Executive Order 14168, defending women from gender ideology extremism and restoring biological truth to the federal government, which has had far too many far-reaching effects for me to enumerate here. He and his administration have extended this rhetoric of defending and protecting by shifting focus to children. Take his Executive Order 14187 on protecting children from chemical and surgical mutilation. It takes aim at gender-affirming care for anyone under the age of 19 and offers directives to various federal agencies aiming at desisting and defunding gender-affirming care broadly. Next, consider President Trump's proclamation on National Child Abuse Prevention Month, which is April every year, if you didn't know. In it, he characterizes gender-affirming care as child abuse, indoctrination, and sexual mutilation. And he conjures the specter of trans people as the gender ideology movement, telling evil and backward lies of gender insanity and breaking the hearts of parents and families. While Canadian policies and law have yet to go to such extremes as calling gender-affirming care mutilation or child abuse, we have seen an uptick in provincial legislative actions, from Saskatchewan to New Brunswick and most recently Alberta. Danielle Smith, Premier of Alberta, opined on her radio show in December last year that, quote, because I feel so strongly about protecting kids' right to preserve their fertility until they're adults, we would, as a last resort, have to use the notwithstanding clause, end quote, in order to protect Bill 26, the Health Statute Amendment Act, which outlaws gender-affirming care for minors from any legal challenge. Clearly, what we face is a panic about fertility, and a worry that whether or not young women and girls turn out to be trans or question their gender at all, that they will begin to reject their fertility. And we can talk about how this is tied to more insidious machinations around forced childbirth by outlawing and criminalizing abortion, making it less available, or to natalism inherent to the far right's ideology, but it's a longer conversation. These myriad manipulations of the legal system to stop youth from accessing healthcare set the stage for a more insidious project taking aim at any and all forms of bodily autonomy for anyone who isn't a cisgender man, and one in particular willing and able to participate in white supremacist, capitalist, cis heteropatriarchy, to elaborate on bell hooks' term. Perhaps the most successful rhetorical move that the far right have made is the conflation of a population with an ideology. Ideas, behaviors, lifestyles. These are all things that are much easier to decry, critique, challenge, or even eliminate. What alarms and admittedly fascinates me is that the very idea that one's sex or gender, if you prefer, could change has been labeled an ideology, whereas the counterposition is touted as commonsensical, factual, or just a reflection of scientific biological reality. And this intentional slippage between transgender people and gender ideology is what enables someone like Michael Knowles to take the stage at CPAC and say something like, for the good of society, transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely, the whole preposterous ideology at every level. To those in the know, this might sound familiar, yet again. Janice Raymond, arguably a foremother of the gender-critical or anti-trans feminist movements, infamously argued in her 1979 screed, The Transsexual Empire, that the problem of transsexualism would best be served by morally mandating it out of existence. Some of my trans siblings have said that this kind of rhetoric amounts to calls for genocide, the erasure of a people, a community, and a way of living and being in the world. But I worry that that argument cedes ground to the far right by allowing them to conflate a population, a people, a community with an ideology, and an ideology that they've had quite a lot of success, at times colluding with self-identified feminists, and convincing people is unscientific, perverse, pathological, and in turn dangerous. So where I want to end, and it will take me a moment to end, so be patient, is by contextualizing this in the larger misinformation epidemic, ecology, agenda, pick your metaphor. Amidst the ongoing culture wars over trans people, there's a prolonged skirmish being waged over the science of sex and gender. We need look no further than this week's UK Supreme Court decision on a biological, in quotes, definition of womanhood, the Cass Review, which I'm happy to say more about if we haven't heard of it, or, in contrast, my own work as part of the only all-trans team tasked with conducting systematic reviews toward the development of a guideline on trans health by the World Health Organization. If that goes anywhere, we shall see. Instead of going down the scientific rabbit hole, I'll turn to Laverne Cox's recent soundbite from The View, in which she says, quote, trans people are less than 1% of the population. They're focused on the wrong 1%. And it's a delightful little quip, like she ate that. And also, two things worry me about this line of defense. First is that we don't have accurate numbers. So putting a firm percentage to the proportion of the population we represent is really difficult because the results of any enumeration process depend almost entirely on how and perhaps by whom we are asked about our genders. The second concern I have is that this framing of trans people as a small little part of the general population sets us up to be victims of the moral panic in ways that depend on our being and remaining small. Couple this with the fact that according to best available data, more and more young people are indeed exploring their genders, and if you listen closely, you can hear the ticking of the time bomb. But I'd challenge us to consider how vulnerable we would need to be as a community to deserve protection and rights. How few of us must there be for us to be non-threatening? And if trans people have been fashioned into a convenient political vessel by the far right, meant to hold the weight of all of the convergent crises of capitalism, then what strength is there in numbers? Ultimately, and I say this with my whole chest, as a quantitative researcher, numbers have not been kind to trans people. Counting us doesn't necessarily make us count. As deserving of rights, as having unique needs, as human the way everyone else is, but they remain necessary. And data, statistics, science, and information remain weapons against the rising tide of anti-trans backlash. However, this is only the case so long as we use the tools to improve the lives of trans people as they are lived. And if we are careful, intentional, and resolute in our commitment to solidarity across difference, we can find ways to improve the lives of everyone by centering trans people. Our lived experiences highlight the violence of existing systems and the threats we all face to our self-determination and bodily autonomy. Dean Spade's suggestion in his book, Normal Life, that trans people are an administrative impossibility rings ever more true now as our existence threatens the imposition of a supposedly natural order. So maybe we are indeed dangerous after all. And maybe that's not such a bad thing.
Thank you so much, Avery. So I think one of the things that's becoming clear is that we can't understand fascism purely in material terms, right? That this is not just, obviously, about the price of eggs. And Gastón Gordillo is going to speak to us along these lines about fascist moods and genocidal passions, the affective dimensions of fascism. Gastón is a professor in anthropology at UBC, a rare non-geographer, and his current work focuses on grassroots activism against deforestation in Argentina, although his work has spanned topics such as rubble and ruination and how violence and insurrections play out spatially. You're up, Gastón.
It's such an honor to be at this amazing event. Thank you so much, Naomi, for inviting me. I revised my title, something like The Elementary Structures of Fascist Affects. So, yeah, I would like to reflect on the affective or emotional dimensions of fascism, inspired by Alberto Toscano's wonderful book, Late Fascism, and his argument that fascism should be examined not only as a social, political, or ideological phenomenon, but also, in his words, as a psychic and libidinal phenomenon, a type of desire, an erotic charge. So here I'm going to elaborate on some ideas I first explored in a review essay of Alberto's book called The Fascist Disposition, published on the Verso blog. So to analyze fascism as a type of propensity to act in the world in a particular way and not in others. This is a propensity certainly guided by ideologies, discourses, and ideas about power, race, masculinity, religion, or nationalism, but that is not reducible to them because they are propelled by what we could call an affective excess. What defines being a fascist in many ways is a visceral, pre-discursive impulse that is primarily reactionary, reactive, negative, what philosopher Spinoza famously called sad passions, expressing the hostility towards racial, political, and gender others. The reactive passions of fascist hatreds are sad, following the Spinoza's language, because they are enslaved to hate rather than being self-affirming. This is why fascist sentiments are the primary products and drivers of counter-revolutions and counter-insurgencies as reactions against perceived threats to the status quo. And as many of the speakers today pointed out, the racialized terror of European fascism in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s had already been deployed for centuries against black and brown bodies outside of Europe. So the threat of rebellions in colonial and settler-colonial settings, the threat of communist revolution in Europe, the threat posed by demands for Palestinian freedom, or the threat posed by demands for decarbonization and climate and racial justice have all tended to activate fascist passions and desires. But as Alberto points out in his book, in a world in which the threat of revolution is clearly not on the horizon, the rise of fascist sentiments worldwide can be more precisely characterized as a preventive counter-revolution. The fascist coup currently unfolding in the US is a case in point, for Trump made it clear he's acting to prevent the woke and lunatic left, as he calls us, from taking over society and destroying our beautiful nation. Fascists rationalize their reactive nature as rightful self-defense. Of course, in different historical moments and different places, these fascist desires activated in self-defense are interpreted by their practitioners through different ideologies, symbols, and narratives, and the specificity of their local conditions. MAGA fascism in the US is for this reason very different from Israeli fascism, and the fascism of the Hindu far right in India is also quite different from the fascism in contemporary Argentina, exemplified by President Milei. If you focus on the different histories, narratives, and experiences that guide this fascism in these different places. And accounting to the specificities and local uniqueness of the affective formations of the far right is certainly crucial to articulate effective political responses against them. But I would argue that it's equally important not to overlook, in the name of locality, difference, and specificity, what on closer inspection fascist dispositions share at an elemental or molecular level. For a comparative review of historical and contemporary fascisms demonstrates that despite their differences, they all articulate common elementary structures that are not only ideological or political, but primarily affective. A disposition to be affected negatively by the presence of racialized others, and especially by their breach of racialized boundaries, and to respond not just with hostility or hatred, but also with disgust at them, with a visceral repulsion. And that's why I was very glad to see that Avery addressed the question of disgust as really central to fascist affects. Obviously, we can find so many examples of this disgust articulated against black or brown people in the US, against Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, Muslims in India, or indigenous and racialized people in Milei's Argentina. But what turns this disgust into a fascist passion, as opposed to merely reactionary passions, is the propensity to respond with violence, and often genocidal violence, to eliminate the source of that disgust. Let me exemplify this fascist elementary disposition with an example from 19th century Argentina. I'm going to read a quote now from Domingo Sarmiento, who was one of the most influential writers, politicians, and intellectuals in Argentina in the 19th century, who was president in the country in the late 1860s, and who conservatives today hail as one of the fathers of the nation. Sarmiento wrote this in 1876. "Will we succeed in exterminating the Indians? I feel an invincible, uncontrollable repugnance for the savages of America. These scoundrels are nothing more than disgusting Indians whom I will hang now if they reappeared. Incapable of progress, their extermination is providential and useful, sublime, and great. They must be exterminated without even sparing the little ones, who already have an instinctive hatred for civilized man." Shortly thereafter, there was an actual genocide that was unleashed on indigenous people in different parts of Argentina. And I'm sure you can recognize in this disturbing quote a family resemblance with similar expressions of disgust towards Palestinians, blacks, brown people, and the call for an elimination that must be, again, complete. Even, as he put it, not even children should be spared. So first, Sarmiento confirms that the genocidal disposition is structured by one of the most visceral, negative, and difficult to control emotions, disgust, which one feels without being able to help it, as he put it in another section of that manuscript. And second, this genocidal drive, driven again by feelings of disgust, includes a notable desensitization towards those deemed killable, including children. Proto-fascists like Sarmiento, in other words, are affected by the presence of Indians with feelings of disgust and an impulse to end that disgust with their genocidal elimination. And at the same time, he clearly shows an ability to be affected by the suffering and death of those he deemed savages. So this takes me to another elemental structure of fascist passions, an affective selectivity combining an extreme insensibility to being affected by certain bodies and simultaneously a notable indifference to others. Which takes me to the question of I will call genocidal passions. On the one, genocides throughout history are known to mobilize a desensitization of the victimizers towards their victims. For instance, capturing the film The Zone of Interest, which depicts the everyday family life in the home of the Auschwitz Nazi commander, seemingly unaffected by the horrors happening behind the wall that separates them from the extermination camp. one could be left with the impression from this movie that the genocide of the European Jews was perpetrated with cold, bureaucratic detachment. But this is obviously only part of the picture. And here I was thinking about another powerful movie, a very different one, the Soviet film Come and See from 1985 by Klimov, that describes another affective dimension of genocide, focusing in this case on the genocidal terror unleashed by Nazi troops in Belarus in 1943. In the most harrowing scene of the film, we see German troops rounding up hundreds of villagers to be exterminated, and we see it doing it joyfully, while singing, dancing, and drinking. These are fascist troops that kill with indifference to the suffering for their victims, but at the same time do it passionately and enthusiastically, with joy. And I would like to reflect briefly on this disturbing counterpoint between the coexistence in the fascist body between an affective desensitization and a joyful affirmation. And this introduces a paradox in my previous description of fascist desires as sad passions. For Spinoza identified joy as the epitome of a positive affect that expands the capacity of the body to act, and in fact is the opposite of a sad passion. The answer to this paradox, I think, is that among fascists who murder joyfully, their joy is subsumed and captured by the negativity of a murderous impulse. In other words, it is a false joy at the service of reactive impulses their subjects don't fully control or understand. And I think this affective counterpoint is crucial to understanding the elementary structure of fascist dispositions in many contemporary settings today. The genocidal and joyful disposition against Muslims that animate the Hindu far right in Modi's India is a case in point. In his analysis of the Gujarat pogrom of 2002, when Hindu mobs massacred about 2,000 Muslims, Richard Seymour, in his book Disaster Nationalism, notes, for instance, the murderous ecstasies associated with the massacre. He cites the Concerned Citizens Tribunal, who remarked on the macabral delight expressed by Hindu spectators of the massacres. And this is the macabral delight proudly displayed by Israeli soldiers on social media while unleashing genocide in Gaza, with the disturbing photos and videos of them dancing and singing amid the rubble, smiling happily while posing with Palestinian trophies and parodying and mocking Palestinian suffering. An example from contemporary Argentina is the fascist intellectual Agustín Laje, one of Milei's main advisors, who admitted last year how much pleasure he felt seeing leftists beat up by the riot police. And I quote, "We celebrate the police, we congratulate them. Each bullet well placed in each leftist has been, for all of us, a moment of joy. Each image of a leftist crying because of pepper spray in their eyes was for us a very pleasurable moment to watch. Those people deserve to be shot," unquote. This admission of his own erotic and psychopathic desire to hurt leftists and his feeling of joy in watching violence by the police is what makes of Laje a textbook fascist. His joy-inducing impulse to celebrate violence. Not unlike the many Israeli soldiers who post TikTok videos of themselves dancing amid the rubble of Gaza, or the Hindu supremacists who massacred Muslims with delight. In today's Argentina, many progressives argue that Milei is not really a fascist because he does not speak like a fascist from Italy in the 1930s or Nazi Germany in the same time period. But this rationalization overlooks what Milei does share with the European fascists of the 1930s and 40s, or with the Israeli fascists of today. An affective disposition to justify violence when people felt to be savage, threatening, and inferior. For Milei has repeatedly celebrated the genocide of indigenous people in Argentina in the late 80s and today's genocide of Palestinians in Israel. In Argentina, Laje and the far right emphasize, paradoxically influenced by Gramsci, that a key front in today's political confrontation is, in Spanish, la batalla cultural, or the cultural battle, or the cultural wars against the left over values, meanings, and symbols. But it could be argued that what is at stake in our struggle against fascism is something deeper, an affective struggle over people's disposition to affect and to be affected in particular ways. And this affective struggle is a crucial front in the struggle against fascism. Because as Deleuze and Guattari put it in a famous quote, affects transpierce the body like arrows. They are weapons of war. Unfortunately, the fascists have been particularly effective in weaponizing affects and exacerbating hatred and genocidal dispositions. That's why we need to weaponize affect in our own struggle against fascism. And to start wrapping up, I think Elon Musk recently made a statement that sums up the affective conundrum in anti-fascist politics today when he said, and I quote, "The fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy." And he argued that empathy is being weaponized by the left to destroy Western civilization. Of course, the fact that the wealthiest billionaire in the world complains that people in rich countries feel too much empathy is an incredible admission of his own delusion. Yet what Musk transparently and correctly identifies is the affective disposition that terrifies fascists the most: empathy, the capacity to be affected by other humans' suffering and to act in solidarity across cultural, political, and racial differences. And this is what makes fascists like Musk, Trump, or Netanyahu share a disposition to be unable to feel empathy for those who suffer because of their actions and who are often brown bodies deemed savages, terrorists, or more recently, gang members. Or to be more precise, fascist dispositions include a racialized selectivity in their empathy, which predisposes them to only feel empathy for some, but not for others, to only feel horror for the 2 redheaded Israeli babies killed in Gaza by Israeli bombardments, and not for the thousands of Palestinian babies killed by Israel, to only feel empathy for the white Afrikaners in South Africa, whom Trump recently offered asylum, and not for the millions of brown immigrants that currently live in fear of being disappeared in the US and sent off to a gulag in El Salvador. The disappearance of Kilmar Abrego Garcia and the refusal of Trump and Bukele to release him gives us another example of the affective war we are immersed in today. To counter the affective impact of the meeting between the senator from Maryland and Kilmar in El Salvador a few days ago, the White House brought a white woman whose daughter had been murdered by an illegal migrant, and this woman described to the press in detail how her daughter was killed and then condemned the senator for trying to free someone who's not even an American citizen. And she said, "I don't understand," she said, looking clearly perplexed, that a white senator will feel moved by the plight of a brown man snatched away from the US. Weaponizing the affective intensity and pain of this woman's experience, the Trump regime deployed the predictably racist logic that an individual murder proved the murderous nature of all migrants, and therefore that Kilmar Abrego Garcia should stay in Bukele's gulag. The message of the White House was clear, and it is a profoundly affective message. You should be more affected, you should be more moved by the terrible experience of this nice white lady than by the brown man who's not even an American citizen. And this is why the challenge we face today is how to devise the affective weapons that will need to pierce through this type of affective walls that prevent millions of people from being affected and moved and disturbed by the many horrors in our world, from the genocide in Gaza to the coming climate collapse. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gastón. We're going to be picking up on that challenge in the afternoon and later on because it's so urgent. What is our passionate response? Like, what are we offering people as an alternative? What kind of unbounded sense of abundance can we create and provide experiences in people's bodies to believe against this deluge of sort of bordered identities and a sense of scarcity? A huge part of the reason we wanted to have this teach-in is because we're blessed to live in the city with one of the foremost scholars of what he calls late fascism, what has become a reference point for all of us. We've all been citing Alberto all day, and so now we finally get to hear from the man himself, who's going to be talking about late fascism and focusing on the point where racial supremacy meets tech supremacy, because we can't forget that this backlash is a backlash of billionaires, literally the richest people on earth, possibly in the history of time. Alberto's recent book, Late Fascism, Race, Capitalism, and the Politics of Crisis, looks at the politics of authoritarianism and how they are linked to capitalism. Alberto, over to you.
Thank you so much, Naomi, and thankfully I'm not as tall as Avery, so this will work, hopefully. Okay, so a famous revolutionary once asked the question, who are our enemies, who are our friends? This paper, alas, will largely deal with the first of these questions, but hopefully it will provide some pointers towards answering the second collectively. Earlier this week, the data analysis defense contractor Palantir launched an ad campaign on elite US campuses. The posters, signed by its CEO, Alex Karp, are headed by the ominous call, "A moment of reckoning has arrived for the West." The micro manifesto, in its, sort of military, corporate, fascistic minimalism, goes on to reward a claim that has been at the center of Palantir founder and venture capitalist impresario of the far right, Peter Thiel's decades-long ideological crusade, ever since he founded the Stanford Review and co-wrote the screed The Diversity Myth Against Multiculturalism and Affirmative Action in Higher Education. Clearly a book on the shelves of some of Brenna and Avery and Naomi and Gastón's colleagues at UBC. This is the idea that Silicon Valley, in cahoots with liberal academic elites, has been captured by a risk-averse, social justice-oriented culture that has systematically avoided tech's true vocation, namely, putting its engineering culture of radical innovation at the service of the project of US and Western supremacy, as in the halcyon days of World War II and the Cold War. This is a reactionary nostalgia indeed, but it is a nostalgia for a virtuous fusion of state, engineering, and capital in the pursuit of military-led global and civilizational supremacy. In the Thiel and Palantir lingo, MAGA translates into the deliberately disturbing slogan on this poster, "We build to dominate." Behind this, we can see something that Malcolm Harris had grasped very acutely in his book Palo Alto. We're writing about Peter Thiel and his, by now, notorious South African connections. I believe his father started was working in a Namibian, leading a Namibian mine to mine uranium for South Africa's nuclear project to, defend apartheid. Harris writes that Thiel is looking for ways not to stall the long wave of decolonization, but to reverse and defeat it. Aside from fealty to Thiel's narrative pitting tech nationalism against woke capital, chauvinist realism against consumerist effeminacy, all undergirded by the racist narrative of diversity destroying merit, Palantir has solid reasons to be on a recruitment drive. Though there was some gloating among critics after its stocks briefly, all too briefly, plummeted in the wake of Trump's tariff announcements, its market capitalization is currently at $220 billion. I believe this is roughly the GDP of Portugal, having almost tripled since September of last year. And no doubt in part thanks to our remarkable ability to cultivate contacts in the state's repressive and ideological apparatuses, including far-right and former Obama appointees Michael Flynn and Tom Homan, it is experiencing a bonanza in government contracts which are tightly linked to America's authoritarian acceleration. It has partnered with Musk's SpaceX and the AI and robotics contractor Anduril, Lord of the Rings far-right obsession, to begin building Trump's Golden Dome. I won't go into the off-color jokes about that name, but nevertheless the US sequel to Israel's Iron Dome, obviously. And Palantir, which of course has a long prided itself in working with ICE and the military, and in pushing back against those tech workers who tried over the last few years to mobilize against Silicon Valley's work with military police and border agencies, has just won, I believe this week, a $29.8 million contract with ICE to enhance what it calls, in this kind of disgusting bureaucratic language, the immigration life cycle operating system, to provide what it calls near-time visibility on so-called self-deportation, and create an integrated and extremely granular system for monitoring, detaining, and expelling people, including being able to cross-reference race, eye color, tattoos, administrative data, bankruptcy filing, port of entry and residence status, social security numbers, and so on. And this is aimed at allowing it, and this is actually a quote from the contract with the government, to complete target analysis of known populations. So Peter mentioned Du Bois in his brilliant talk earlier. There's a phrase in one of Du Bois' essays where he talks about the racial dividends of capitalism, and I think contemporary capitalism has, alas, a lot of racial dividends. Palantir's work is hardly limited to the US, and the company and CEO Alex Karp have been extremely vocal about their ideological and material support for Israel as it carries out its genocide in Gaza. The company does not just stand with Israel, as a full-page ads it took out declare. In January of 2024, it held an extraordinary board meeting in Tel Aviv in solidarity and has touted its strategic partnership with the Israeli Ministry of Defense, providing it with battle tech, including possibly what it calls its artificial intelligence platform. As Spencer Ackerman suggested in a Nation article on the corporate winners of the war on Gaza, this is not just data mining, but death mining. Western supremacy is defined for Palantir, as for much of the global far right, by an intransigent defense of Zionism, in fact, an identification with Zionism at its most exterminatory, as well as by the war on dissent at home. As Karp expounded in an interview with CNBC in 2024 at Davos, it's not just about Israel. Do you believe in the West? Do you believe it is, as created, a superior way of living? Are you willing to admit you believe that? Arguably far more than in Musk's dark MAGA trolling Nazi salutes and natalism, it is in a company like Palantir that we can track and anatomize the material and symbolic trajectory of tech supremacy as it moves from the spectrum of tech nationalism, tech national conservatism, and outright tech fascism. Technology scholar and critic Jathan Sadovsky put the matter starkly in a recent post. I quote, "From inception, Palantir's purpose has been to provide the data infrastructure for fascism. They create the ontology layer of fascism, helping to give its ideological goals a material reality. For decades, Palantir has been working toward this moment." We could, end of quote, we could say it is building software to cognitively map and logistically integrate the apparatuses of domination, which is also to say of tracking, of detention, of exclusion, of repression, and of killing. One of the methodological and political conundrums that we face and that bedevils anti-fascist theorizing, and it is a problem that is especially acute in a period such as our own, when the concentration and personalization of power has reached such absurd peaks, what Mike Davis in his last essay called the nightmare edition of Great Men Make History, has to do with the relative weight to be accorded to the more strictly ideological dimensions of contemporary fascist phenomena, the mentalities, the intellectual influences, the weird pet theories, the court philosophers, the worldviews of our reactionary masters of the universe. The case of Palantir, and the inextricable one of its founder, Peter Thiel, is interesting because the contribution to the infrastructure of late fascism is here accompanied by a wish, a dogged, obsessive wish to legitimize it at the level of discourse. So, accompanying the Trumpian windfall experienced by Palantir, we also have been fortunate enough, I say with some sarcasm, to have the book The Technological Republic, Hard Power, Soft Belief, and the Future of the West, published by CEO Alex Karp, co-written by one of his employees, and 85% as apparently 85% chance that it was AI enhanced, and then blurred by such wonderful luminaries as Niall Ferguson, JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon, General James Mattis, and former NATO head Anders Fogh Rasmussen. It's a very weird and prolix book, which I've subjected myself to reading over the past few days, replete with often inconclusive and anecdotal references ranging from Habermas, who was briefly Alex Karp's PhD supervisor, to Jackson Pollock, René Girard, to David Graeber, and so on. In the end, it's an improbable but symptomatic mashup of the neoconservative tract and the company brochure. The campus poster I cited at the beginning is basically its abstract, as it tries to vault a commitment to a moral and material rearmament of the nation state, and the West more broadly, with an effort to sing the praises of an engineering culture based on risk, nonconformity, and forms of experimentation that draw from an avant-garde art, as well as ethological studies of swarming bees and whatnot. But most relevant to our purposes here is its particular inflection, and I'll bring this towards the conclusion, of the counter-revolutionary motif. The thesis, which it shares with so much of the MAGA nebula, including Christian social conservatism, Bannonite populism, and so on, is that a kind of liberal elite compact between Silicon Valley, elite academia, and the Beltway establishment and the media has led to a kind of risk-averse, cancel culture hampered consumerist nihilism, which is sapping the moral conviction and technological dynamism of the West as it faces a challenge of the AI revolution and emergent Chinese hegemony, or Chinese AI as the kind of apocalyptic obsession. It's a MAGA message for tech engineers with intellectual ambitions. What is particularly symptomatic is that in misnaming constantly liberalism as the left, it can't identify an actual left except by way of grotesque misrepresentation. After having lambasted university administrators for, I quote, systematically punishing anything approaching moral courage and incentivizing its opposite, which is entirely true, but for the opposite reason that he thinks, Karp, the CEO of a company that profits massively from surveillance and data mining system, tasks with the deportation of dissidents and the undocumented, and now engaged in an all-out war against the encampment movement and all of its consequences, writes, and this is from the book, it's a kind of very symptomatic passage which I'll read. Amid the campus protests across the United States in 2024, following Israel's invasion and bombardment of Gaza, which was probably written by ChatGPT because it's a little too truthful vis-a-vis the rest of the book, a growing number of student protesters began concealing their faces with scarves and masks. No shit, you run a data mining company. The rationale was that exposure of their identities would jeopardize their futures. It did. From depriving them of job opportunities to facing criticism of social media, or being sent to concentration camps in Louisiana. A student protester told a reporter that the potential costs were too great to risk being identified. If I give my name, I lose my future. And this is a comment from Karp. But is a belief that has no cost really a belief? The protective veil of anonymity may instead be robbing this generation of an opportunity to develop an instinct for real ownership over an idea, of the rewards of victory in the public square, as well as the cost of defeat. I mean, it's kind of really just the gall of writing that, or having a machine write that sentence is kind of remarkable. This is from the same book, and obviously the anti-Palestinian, not so unconscious, not so political unconscious is evident. The same book that, in a variation of the cultural Marxism and conspiracy theory, treats Edward Said's Orientalism as the main culprit for the emasculation of an academic world formerly built around Western civ, and of course the basis of tech engineering prowess and so on. As Karp declares, Said's book destabilized, I quote, an entire academic mode of being across the university establishment, if only. It was the vehicle through which academia would be remade. Yeah. Thinking through and countering the role of a firm like Palantir in wielding together racial supremacy over Palestinians or over migrants and dissidents with tech supremacy means reckoning with the fact that the infrastructure facilitating and enhancing fascist processes and potentials is enmeshed with a very deliberate discursive struggle, while also realizing, and I think this is not insignificant, that this was always also a sales pitch, hype. Tech power is about building the infrastructure, the logistics of domination, but it's also about making its speech acts very lucrative, about profiting not just from fear of migrants, of AI, over the coming war with China, but from discourse itself. As is true of most tech firms, Palantir's market valuation, after all, is highly disproportionate to its revenue, notwithstanding the fact that its revenue, thanks to the state, is quite high. And that gap is bridged not only by networks of power, but by words. Fascist speech is good business, and it does pay racial dividends. The infrastructure and the ideology of an increasingly fascistic and bellicose tech sector are both interlocking and asymmetrical. The infrastructure strives for fungibility and homogeneity. Say, and this is very significant work that Palantir is doing right now, fully integrating the data systems of ICE and the Internal Revenue Service in the United States, while the ideology shows its seams and contradictions far more readily. It is tempting, I think, for us to overemphasize the importance of the discourse of the far right, not least because the ontology layer of late fascism, so to speak, is one which has been built across liberal and conservative administrations. Unlike his friend Peter Thiel, we should note, CARP backed and funded both Biden and Kamala Harris. We should not ignore ideology critique, but this must always be subordinated to the abolition of the infrastructure of domination. If we want to build to liberate, there's much that demands not just to be defunded, but to be abolished and to be destroyed. All the instruments, the legal instruments, the logistical instruments, the lethal instruments of contemporary fascism were already here and they were already at work, and we forget that at our peril. Thank you.